There's a kind of laughter that's worse than cruelty. It's the gentle kind. The kind men give each other across a fence line, hats tipped back, thumbs hooked in their belts, voices easy. You sure about that, Doyle? Digging a house into the side of a hill like a prairie dog. Nobody was mean about it. That's the part I've never been able to scrub off myself. We weren't mean. We just knew better. We'd all built our places the way our fathers built theirs, up high, square to the wind, proud against the sky. He built his low. He built it into the earth, like he was hiding from something. And for 2 years we let him hear about it every chance we got, in that warm, ribbing way that lets a man pretend he isn't being told he's a fool. Then the sky went the color of a bruise on the 8th of February, and the radio quit, and the wind came down out of the bighorns carrying snow the way a flood carries a barn. By the second night there were families on this stretch of road praying into the dark, and trucks frozen sideways in drifts, and a baby out near the henning place that nobody could get to. And there was one window on the whole prairie still glowing. I'm an old man now, and I've stopped trusting the things I'm certain about. But I'll tell you what I saw out there, and what it cost me to understand it, and you can do with it what you want. This is the story of Mercer Doyle, his dugout house, the worst storm in 40 years, and the night the rest of us learned that the man we'd been laughing at had been the only one paying attention the whole time. I keep a logbook, always have. Spiral-bound, the kind you buy 3 for $1 at the feed store, and I write the weather in it every morning before coffee because my father did and his father did, and because a man who doesn't write down the weather out here is a man who's decided to be surprised by his own life. Rainfall, wind, first frost, last frost, the day the meadowlarks come back. 41 years of them stacked in a shoebox in my closet, and the truth is most days say the same thing, which is nothing happened, the cattle ate, the sun went down. The page for February the 8th is the only one I've ever torn out and taped back in. I tore it out because I couldn't stand to look at what I'd written that morning, before I knew anything. Then I taped it back because I decided I didn't have the right to pretend I'd been wiser than I was. It says in my own ugly handwriting, cold front coming, Doyle still living in his hole. Some folks never learn. That was me. That was the last thing I wrote as the man I used to be. Let me back you up. Mercer Doyle moved onto the old Prout quarter section in the spring of '78. Bought it cheap because the house had burned down to the foundation 2 winters before, and nobody wanted the bother of a place with no place on it. He came from somewhere east, Nebraska, somebody said, though Mercer never said much about it and I never asked, because out here asking a man where he's from is halfway to asking what he's running from, and we don't do that. He had a wife, Ruth, a quiet woman with chapped red hands and a way of looking at you a half-second too long like she was deciding something. And 2 kids, a boy, Sam, maybe 9 that first spring, and a girl, June, small enough that Ruth still carried her on a hip. I went over the first week, like you do. Brought a casserole my late wife had taught me to make before she passed, which is to say, I brought a sad and lumpy thing in a foil pan, and Mercer met me at the property line with mud to his elbows and grease in the creases of his knuckles and a grin like he'd been caught at something. "You're the rancher," he said, "Whitfield north of here." "Tom Whitfield." I handed over the foil pan. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere." He looked at the casserole like it was the kindest thing anybody'd done for him in a long while, and I'd come to learn that for Mercer Doyle it probably was. "Come see what I'm building," he said. And he walked me out behind the burned foundation to the south face of a low rise, what we call a coulee bank, a long, slow shoulder of land, and he showed me a hole. That's what it was in May of '78. A hole. He dug back into the hillside with a borrowed backhoe, a great square wound in the earth, and he'd started laying up walls of concrete block from the bottom, and there were timbers stacked everywhere, and a roll of black plastic sheeting big as a hay bale, and I stood there with my hat in my hands not knowing what to say. "You're putting your house in the hill," I said finally. "Into it, 3 sides, bermed up over the top." He was beaming. He had this energy about him, Mercer, when he talked about the thing like a boy showing you a fort. The earth never gets colder than about 50 degrees a few feet down. Doesn't matter what the air does. 40 below, 100 above, down here it just stays. So I'm not fighting the cold all winter. I'm letting the ground do the work. South wall's all glass, see, faces the low winter sun, soaks it up all day. North, east, west, buried. Wind's got nothing to grab. I remember nodding the way you nod at a man telling you about a dream he had. Polite. Empty. I remember thinking, this poor fellow's read a magazine article and now his family's going to spend the winter in a root cellar. What about water? I said. Hill like that, snowmelt's going to run right into your living room. His face did something then, a little flicker, and I'd find out years later that I'd put my thumb right on the thing that had kept him up nights. Drainage, he said. Gravel bed, French drain along the back slopes it away. I've thought about it. He said it a little too firm. The way you say a thing you've decided to believe. I told him it looked like a lot of work. I told him to holler if he needed a hand. And I drove home, and I'll be honest with you, I laughed. Not cruel. Just to myself in the truck, the way you laugh at the strangeness of people. Buried his house. Lord. By the time I got home, it was a story to tell. And out here, a story is a kind of currency. I spent it. You have to understand how it spread, because the spreading of it is the part I'm ashamed of, more than the laughing. There were maybe a dozen of us along that stretch of county road and the section roads off it. The Hennings, the Vasquez place, old Carl Brandt, the Kowalski brothers, me. We saw each other at the grain elevator, and the church, and the one cafe in town that had coffee worth the drive. And Mercer Doyle's house gave us something to talk about that wasn't cattle prices or rain, and we are a people starved for things to talk about. The mole man, Carl Brandt called him, and it stuck, God help me. Not to his face, never to his face. To his face we were friendly, we're not animals, we waved, we'd stop and jaw if we passed on the road. But behind the hand over coffee, how's the mole man? You hear he ran a stovepipe up through the dirt. Reckon his kids have got grass growing on the roof. The grass thing was true, actually. By the second summer, Mercer had sodded the whole top of the place, and it grew tall and green right over where his family slept. And his boy Sam used to lie up there in the evenings. And from the road you'd see a kid stretched out on a hillside that happened to have a chimney coming out of it. And I won't pretend it didn't look like the strangest thing in 3 counties. But here's what I didn't let myself notice, because noticing it would have spoiled the joke. Mercer Doyle's place was warm. I knew it because Ruth told my late wife's sister at a quilting thing before my wife passed, and it came back to me down the chain the way everything does out here. Said they ran the wood stove maybe a third of what everybody else did. Said the kids never woke up cold. Said in August, when the rest of us were lying in our own sweat with the windows open praying for a breath of air, her kitchen stayed cool as a cellar, and she could bake bread at noon in July and not want to die. I heard that and I filed it under well. Isn't that nice? And I went right on calling him the mole man in my head, because a man's pride is a strange engine, and mine had decided early that Mercer Doyle was a fool, and it did not want to be told otherwise. The kids, though, the kids worked on me. Sam Doyle took to coming over to my place when he was 11, 12, because I had a creek with trout in it and a dog that had just had pups, and a boy will walk 2 miles for a pup. He was a serious child, watchful like his mother. He'd help me with the fence and not say much, and then out of nowhere he'd ask a question that stopped me cold. Once he was maybe 12. We were stringing wire and he said, "Mr. Whitfield, why does everybody think my dad's stupid?" I about dropped the come along. Now who told you that? Nobody told me. He kept his eyes on the wire. I just know. The way they say, "How's your dad?" like there's a joke in it. He pulled the strand tight. He's not stupid. He reads all the time. He figured the whole house out himself with a pencil. He's the smartest person I know. I didn't have anything to say to that. I think I said something like, "Your dad's a fine man," which is the kind of thing you say when you've been caught and you don't want to admit you've been caught. And Sam looked at me the half second too long, the way his mother did, deciding something. Then he went back to the wire. I thought about that for a long time after, still do. The winter of 78-79 was mild. So was 79-80. That's a piece of it people forget when they tell this story now. And they do tell it now. It's become a kind of legend along that road, only they tell it wrong. They tell it like everybody always knew Mercer was right. We didn't. We had 2 soft winters in a row, and a soft winter is the worst thing that can happen to a man who's trying to learn a lesson, because it lets him keep being a fool a little longer. Those 2 mild years, the joke aged into something almost fond. The mole man. He was just Mercer now, the odd duck up the road with the grass roof, and the strangeness of his house had stopped being a scandal and become a feature of the landscape, like Carl's leaning windmill or the dead cottonwood at the section corner. Folks even came around to a grudging respect for the work of it. You couldn't dig and pour and timber a thing like that with your own 2 hands and a borrowed backhoe, and not earn some respect for the sweat, whatever you thought of the sense. I'd made a kind of peace with him, even. After my wife passed in the fall of '80, cancer fast, the kind that doesn't let you get used to it, it was Ruth Doyle who showed up on my porch with a casserole, returning the favor 2 years late, and it was Mercer who came and sat with me a whole afternoon and didn't say more than 10 words, and somehow that was exactly right. He just sat. He knew how to be quiet next to a man's grief. I've never forgotten it. So we were friendly. We were. But friendly isn't the same as seeing somebody, and I want to be honest about the difference, because the whole weight of what I'm telling you sits on that difference. I liked Mercer Doyle, and I still thought, somewhere underneath, that he'd built his family a foolish house. Both of those were true in me at the same time, and that's the kind of thing a man can carry comfortably for years and never have to settle. Until the winter of '82 came down off the mountains to settle it for him. The morning of February the 8th started ordinary, which is how all the bad ones start. Clear and bitter, maybe 10 below, the snow from the week before crusted hard enough to walk a horse on. I did my chores in the half-dark, broke the ice on the stock tank, fed out. I wrote my log. Cold front coming. Doyle still living in his hole. Some folks never learn. I'd heard the front mentioned on the radio out of Sheridan, but the radio said a lot of things, and I'd seen 100 fronts come down and amount to a day of weather and a story. I should have read the sky better. The light had a flat, dirty quality by mid-morning, and the cattle were uneasy, bunching against the south fence, and the barometer in my entryway, my father's barometer, brass, the one true prophet in my house, had dropped overnight further than I'd ever seen it drop. I noticed all of it. I noticed it the way you notice a sound in the night and decide it's the house settling. The snow started a little after noon. Not dramatic. Big lazy flakes, the friendly kind. By 2 o'clock it was coming harder, and the wind had swung around to the northwest and picked up a meanness. And by 3 the world outside my kitchen window had gone white and flat, and the fence posts 20 yards off were ghosts. By 4 I couldn't see the barn. I'd been through blizzards. Every winter out here you get a day or 2 when the world erases itself and you stay in and wait. So I wasn't frightened, not yet. I'd brought the stock in clothes, I had wood, I had a freezer full of beef. I made myself supper, and I listened to the wind work itself up into something I didn't have a word for, a long unbroken roar like a freight train that never finished passing. And I thought, this is a big one, and I felt, God forgive me, a little thrill of it, the way you do when the weather is finally bigger than your boredom. Then the power went. That happens. You light the lamps and you wait. But the power went and didn't flicker back, and an hour later the phone was dead too, the lines down somewhere out in the white, and that's when the size of the thing started to come up through the floor of me like cold through boot leather. Because I was alone, and the temperature was falling, and out there in that screaming dark were 11 other households strung along a road that no longer existed, and not one of us could reach another. I banked the stove and I sat up in the dark with my father's barometer and I listened. And somewhere in the worst of the night, 2, 3 in the morning, the wind so loud the windows hummed with it. I found myself thinking about Mercer Doyle, about the warm, low house dug into the south face of the coulee, 3 sides of it wrapped in 50-degree earth that didn't care what the sky was doing, the wind finding nothing to grab, the family sleeping under their grass roof, while the storm tore itself apart on the surface of a world they'd stepped out of. For the first time in 4 years, I didn't think it was foolish. I thought it was the smartest thing I'd ever heard of, and I was ashamed, and I was cold, and I had no idea yet that by morning that screaming dark would put a choice in front of all of us, one with a life on the wrong side of it, and that the answer would be sitting in the one house we'd all spent 4 years laughing at. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The worst of it hadn't even started. Morning came, but you couldn't have called it light. The dark just thinned into a gray that hurt to look at, a flat blind nothing pressed up against the glass, and the wind hadn't quit, hadn't even paused to catch its breath in 18 hours. I'd slept maybe an hour in the chair by the stove, my father's barometer in my lap like a thing I could protect, and I woke with a crick in my neck and a fire down to coals, and a window so packed with snow on the outside that the gray came through it the way light comes through a closed eyelid. I want to tell you what that kind of cold does to a house, because unless you've sat inside one you don't know. It comes in along the floor first. You feel it at your ankles, a slow river of it, and you keep the stove roaring and it doesn't matter. The heat goes straight up and the cold pools at your feet and creeps higher, hour by hour, and you start wearing your coat indoors and then your hat, and you stop taking your gloves off except to feed the fire, and you understand in your body, not your head, that the only thing between you and the white outside is how much wood you've got and how long your arms hold out. I had wood. I put up 6 cords that fall because some animal sense in me had told me to, and I thanked that animal all that long gray morning. But I kept doing a sum I didn't like. 6 cords gets a careful man through a normal winter. I was burning through it now like a man trying to keep a forge lit, and the storm gave no sign of being a thing that ended. And every time I fed the fire I thought of that south wall of glass soaking up a winter sun, and that 50-degree earth that didn't care, and Ruth Doyle baking bread. It was a little after what I figured for noon when I heard the snowmobile. You don't forget a sound like that coming out of a silence that isn't a silence, coming up through the roar of the wind, this high mechanical whine, weaving and dropping and rising again. I got to the window and scratched a hole in the frost with my thumbnail and saw nothing, of course, just the white. But it came closer and closer, and then there was a shape out there, a dark smudge fighting through the drifts, and it stopped at where my gate would be if the world still had gates, and a man fell off it into the snow. I had the door open before I'd thought about it, and the storm came into my house like an animal, like it had been waiting at the door all night for me to be fool enough to open it. The cold of it. I've felt cold my whole life and I'd never felt that. It went through wool and flannel and skin, and into the actual bone instantly, like the air had teeth. The man on my step was young Pete Vasquez, Esteban's boy, and he was so caked in ice and snow he looked like something dug out of a glacier, and he couldn't talk for a minute, couldn't make his jaw work. And I got him in and got the door shut against the screaming, and sat him down by the stove, and his whole body was shaking so hard the chair walked across the floor. When he could talk, the first word out of him was a name, Hennings. I waited. The Henning baby. He got his gloves off and his hands were the color of a dead man's. The little one, Katie, she's sick. They think it's her lungs. Esther can't get her breath right. The baby, she's been bad since yesterday and now she's worse and the Hennings can't. He stopped, swallowed, made himself slow down. Phone's dead. Truck won't start, won't even turn over. It's frozen solid. Roads are gone, Tom. There's drifts taller than the cab between here and town. There's no getting to a doctor. There's no getting anywhere. I felt the floor of my stomach drop out. The Hennings were 4 miles off, the far end of the road, the most exposed place on the whole stretch, a tall, proud farmhouse standing square to the wind on a flat with nothing to break the weather for a mile in any direction. The kind of house we all admired. The kind of house I had. "How'd you even get here?" I said. "Sled," he meant the snowmobile. Borrowed it off Carl Brand in the fall, never gave it back. A ghost of his own grin crossed his frozen face and died. "Been going house to house. Tom, it's bad. The Kowalskis are out of fuel oil, they're burning furniture. Carl's roof's leaking from the drifting, water coming in. My folks are okay, but my dad's chest is acting up in the cold and you know his heart's no good. Everybody's hunkered down and everybody's running out of something. Wood, oil, propane. And this thing's supposed to go another 2 days at least. That's what the radio said before it died. 2 more days. 2 more days." I did the sum again, faster. 6 chords. 2 more days of burning like this, and then what? A thaw. Out here a February storm doesn't thaw. It blows itself out and then it sits 20, 30 below for a week, and the roads stay shut till the county gets a plow through, and the county's got 100 miles of road and one storm doesn't care about your woodpile. I looked at Pete Vasquez shaking by my stove and I understood. The way you understand a thing all at once, even though it had been true the whole time, that we were not going to all make it through this in our own houses. The math didn't work. Somebody's wood would run out, or somebody's heart, or somebody's lungs, a baby's lungs, and there was no doctor and no plow and no phone and no help coming from anywhere on God's earth in time to matter. We were on our own, 11 households scattered, each one a little island going cold. And then Pete said the thing that turned the whole night around. "I've been to Doyle's," he said. I made him tell it twice. He'd gone to the Doyle place because it was on his way and because, in the back of his half-frozen mind, some instinct had carried him there. The same instinct, I think, that had made me sit up all night thinking about that warm, low house. He'd pulled up to it, or to where it was, because you could hardly see it. The drifting had buried the grass roof, so the whole thing was just a swell in the snow with a stovepipe and a faint thread of smoke and one window. The big south window, glowing yellow through the white like the last lit window in the world. He'd knocked, and Mercer had opened the door, and a wall of warmth had come out of it. "Warm, Tom," Pete's voice cracked on it. "Like shirt sleeves warm. The kids were on the floor playing cards. Ruth had soup on. The wind, you couldn't hardly hear the wind in there. 3 sides of that house are dirt. The storm can't even find it. It's down under everything. It's..." He shook his head like he couldn't make the words hold it. I was so cold I about cried when that heat hit me. And Mercer's standing there in his sock feet and he says, "Pete, you look half dead, get in here." And I'm thinking, my whole life everybody laughed at this house. My dad laughed, I laughed. And it's the warmest building in the county and it's burning hardly any wood and the storm can't touch it. He looked up at me. "He's got room," Pete said. "That's why I came to you. He's got room and he's got heat for nothing, and he said send everybody. Said pack 'em in. Said there's no winter that house can't beat and there's no reason for anybody to freeze 4 miles from a place that stays warm on its own." I stood there in my coat and hat in my own cold house, and I felt something turn over in my chest that I've never had a good name for. Shame's part of it, but it was bigger than shame. It was the feeling of watching a thing you'd been wrong about your whole life stand up in front of you and not even be angry about it. Send everybody. Pack 'em in. 4 years of the mole man, and Mercer Doyle's answer to it was to throw his door open to every soul who'd ever laughed. "The Henning baby," I said. Pete's face went tight. "That's the thing. That's why I'm Tom, getting everybody to Doyle's, the able folks. That's hard, but it's doable. The sled can run people 2 at a time. It's slow, but I can do it. But the Hennings are the far end, and they got a sick baby, and Esther's not strong herself. She's still poorly from the birth, and that's 4 miles through this on a snowmobile with a baby that can't breathe right." He swallowed. "And there's only the one sled, and it's already low on fuel. And if I run it down hauling everybody, there might not be enough left to make the far run when it counts." There it was, the choice, laid out on my kitchen floor in the gray light like a thing somebody had dragged in. Let me put it to you the way it sat on us, because the way it sat on us is the heart of this whole story, and the legend gets it wrong. The legend makes it sound simple, makes it sound like everybody just rushed to help, hearts of gold, prairie folk pulling together. It wasn't simple. Nothing true ever is. The sled had maybe, Pete figured, 2 more good runs of fuel in it. Maybe 3 if the drifts cooperated, which they wouldn't. Each run to Doyle's was a couple miles, slow going, and there were the Kowalskis and Carl Brandt and Pete's own folks and old this one and that one, a dozen people who needed moving before their wood or their oil or their hearts gave out. Every one of those runs spent fuel. The Henning run was 4 miles out and 4 back. 8 miles, with a sick baby and a weak mother in the teeth of it at the far blind end of the road. The arithmetic was as cruel as the cold. You could spend the fuel saving the many who were probably going to be all right for another day. Or you could spend it on the long, desperate run for the one, the smallest one, who might already be past saving, and who might die on the back of that machine 4 miles from anywhere, and take the fuel and the hope down with her. Pete had come to me, I understood, because he couldn't carry it alone. 22 years old, and the whole math of who lived had landed on him, because he was the one with the borrowed snowmobile, and he'd ridden through hell to lay it on a table where an older man could help him hold it. And here's the part I'm least proud of and most have to tell you. My first thought, my very first before the better part of me caught up, was the able folks first, the sure thing. You can't gamble the fuel on a baby that's maybe already gone. It went through me cold and clear and practical, the rancher's arithmetic, the same arithmetic that decides which calf you can save and which you can't when the spring storms come. I have made that calculation 100 times with animals. It came to me out of habit, fast and certain, and it was monstrous. And I knew it was monstrous even as I thought it, and I have never told a living soul until now that it crossed my mind. What I said out loud was, "We have to ask Mercer." I don't fully know why I said it. Mercer Doyle had no more standing to make that call than I did. He wasn't the oldest, wasn't kin to the Hennings, wasn't anything but the odd man up the road. But some part of me had already begun to turn toward that warm, low house as the place where the right thing might be found, the way you turn toward the one lit window. If the answer existed, I thought, it was in there. Not in me. I'd just proven what was in me. The ride to Doyle's I'll keep short because there isn't language for it. Pete put me on the back of that machine and we went out into the white and the world stopped existing. There was no up, no down, no horizon, just gray on gray and the engine, and the cold reaching into my chest to squeeze my heart slow, and Pete's back in front of me as the only solid fact in creation. He drove by feel, by memory of where the road had been. Twice the machine slewed sideways into a drift, and we dug it out with our hands, and the second time I couldn't feel my hands at all. I was watching them dig like they belonged to somebody else. And then there was a glow, low and yellow and steady in all that screaming nothing. We came over the swell of buried roof, and down to the south face, and the big window was lit, and the snow around it had melted back in a little apron from the warmth bleeding through the glass. The only bare ground, I'd bet, for 50 miles. And the door opened before we reached it, and there was Mercer Doyle in his sock feet with the light, and the heat pouring out around him into the dark. The heat hit me like Pete said it would. I about went to my knees in it. 18 hours of cold came off me all at once and my eyes ran, and I couldn't tell if it was the warmth or something else, and Mercer caught my arm and steered me in, and the door shut, and the wind. The wind went away. That's the thing I'll never forget. The wind that had been the whole world for 18 hours, that freight train roar that had filled my skull till I'd stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing your own blood. Down in that buried house it was a distant thing, a hush, a sound from another country. 3 feet of earth on 3 sides and the storm couldn't get a grip. The walls held a stillness I hadn't felt since before the snow started. The kids, Sam was 14 now, near grown, and little June maybe 7, were on a rag rug by the stove with a deck of cards, and they looked up at me with the calm faces of children who were not cold, and did not understand why a grown man had come in from the dark with tears freezing on his face. Ruth put a bowl of soup in my hands without asking. It was warm clear through to the bottom, and I held it and shook. And I told them about the Hennings, about the baby, Katie, and her lungs, about the one sled and the cruel little tank of fuel and the math of the many and the one. The room went quiet, even the children felt it. Mercer Doyle sat down across from me at his own table, in the warm yellow light of the house we'd all called a hole, and he was quiet for a long moment the way he'd been quiet beside my grief 2 winters before. He had grease in his knuckles still. He always did, like the work of the place had stained into him permanently. He looked at his own 2 kids on the rug. He looked at Ruth. And I watched a man do the hardest arithmetic there is, right there at his kitchen table, and come out the other side of it. "You take the sure runs first," he said quietly. "The Kowalskis, Carl, your folks, Pete, get them here, everyone you can." Pete's face fell, and I felt my own heart drop, because it sounded like the cold answer, the practical answer, the one I'd been ashamed to think. "And while you're running them," Mercer said, "I'll go for the baby." I didn't understand. "Go how? There's one sled, Mercer, and Pete needs it for the runs, that's the whole." He was already up, already pulling a coat off a peg, already moving toward the back of the house where I'd never been, where the buried part went deep into the hill. "There's not one way to cross snow," he said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard in 4 years of knowing him, not the boy showing off his fort, not the man sitting quiet with grief, something older, something that had been waiting. "I've been getting ready for a winter like this since the day I broke ground here. Everybody figured I built a warm house. I didn't build a warm house." He looked back at me from the dark mouth of the hill. "I built a house that could survive. There's a difference, and I built more than the house." He pulled a string and a bare bulb came on in the back room, and I came up off the bench and crossed the warm floor to see what Mercer Doyle had been building in his hole all these years that none of us, laughing on the road, had ever once thought tea. The back room of Mercer Doyle's house went deep into the hill, deeper than I'd have guessed from outside, and the bare bulb showed me a workshop. That's the plain word for it, but it doesn't hold what I was looking at. A long bench, tools hung in their outlines on a board, the smell of cut wood and machine oil and earth. And along the back wall, lashed up off the floor on pegs, the thing he'd been building. It was a sled, not a snowmobile, a sled, the kind a man pulls or a horse pulls, but built like nothing I'd seen. Long and low and curved up at the nose like the front of a boat, the runners broad as my hand, the whole frame steam-bent ash and oak, light enough that I lifted the tail of it with 2 fingers and tight enough that it didn't give a millimeter. There was a kind of basket built into the middle of it, walled and floored, lined with what I'd later learn was sheepskin and felted wool, with a hooped cover that could fold up over the top like the bonnet on a baby carriage. "It's a toboggan," I said stupidly. "It's a rescue sled." Mercer was pulling it down off the pegs, checking the lashings with those grease-dark hands, fast and sure, like a man who'd rehearsed this 100 times in his head. "Broad runners so it floats on the drift instead of cutting in. The basket holds a person lying down, keeps the wind off them, keeps the warm in. I built it the second winter after the soft one. Everybody decided I was harmless by then. A short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. I let them. Easier to get left alone." "Pulled by what?" He looked at me. "By me," he said. "I want to stop here and tell you about a thing I've thought about every year since. On the 8th of February, which is the only day I ever take the shoebox of logbooks down off the closet shelf." We had all looked at Mercer Doyle for 4 years and seen one thing, a man who'd built a strange house and was too proud or too odd to admit it was foolish. That's all we let ourselves see. And the whole time, down in that hill, he'd been quietly building the rest of an answer to a question the rest of us hadn't even known we were going to be asked. He hadn't built a warm house to win. He'd built it because somewhere in him, Nebraska, wherever he came from, whatever he was running from, he'd looked hard at this country and understood a thing the rest of us, born to it, had stopped seeing. That the land out here will kill you patiently the first winter you stop respecting it, and that the proud square house standing tall against the sky is a house that has decided to fight the weather, and the weather always, always wins the long fight. Mercer hadn't decided to fight it. He decided to disappear under it and let it pass over and be ready, on the one day in 40 years it came down like the end of the world, to go out into it and pull a sick child home. I didn't have any of those words that night. That night I just watched him sling a harness over his shoulders, a real harness, padded, the kind you'd put on a draft animal built to his own frame, and I said the only thing I had, which was, "Mercer, it's 4 miles. In this. A man can't pull a loaded sled 4 miles into that wind. It'll kill you." "Probably can't," he agreed. He cinched a buckle. "But the sled floats where the snowmobile sinks, and I won't be fighting the wind the whole way. There's the fence lines, the coulee. I know every windbreak between here and the Hennings. I've walked it in summer thinking about exactly this." He looked up. "And Tom, you're going to drive the able folks here on the sled machine, and the last run you make you're going to come find me. Bring the fuel that's left in a can. If I'm down, you come fast. If I make it to the Hennings, you meet me on the way back and we put the baby and Esther on the snowmobile and run them in, and I walk home empty, which a man can do." He said it all flat and clear, a plan, every piece of it thought through. Don't argue the parts, just do them. Ruth had come to the doorway. She'd been listening. Her chapped red hands were folded in front of her and her face had gone very still, and I braced for her to stop him. I think I wanted her to. I think I wanted somebody to make this not happen. And instead she crossed the room and she fixed his collar, this small, ordinary gesture, smoothing it down where the harness had bunched it, and she said, "You take the wool hat, not the felt one." That was all. That was a wife of 15 years sending her husband out to maybe die, telling him to take the warm hat, because anything more would have been more than either of them could carry standing up. She held the doors in her latch. Sam, 14, near a man, stood by the stove with his sister's hand in his, watching his father go, and his serious, watchful face was working hard to hold itself, and I thought of a 12-year-old boy stringing fence with me saying he's the smartest person I know, and I had to look away. Then Mercer Doyle leaned into the harness and stepped out into the white and was gone. And the wind that had gone away, while the door was shut, came roaring back in for 1 second before Ruth latched it, like it had reached in to grab him. The runs are a blur to me even now. I want to be honest about that. The legend gives me a hero's clear memory and I don't have one. I have pieces. Pete and I traded the snowmobile back and forth. I'd ridden it as a young man, and my hands remembered more than my head did. The Kowalski brothers, 2 big silent men, came 2 at a time clutching me from behind, and the look on their faces when the warmth of Doyle's house hit them. I'd seen that look on my own face in the dark window glass. Carl Brandt, who'd coined the Mole Man, came in soaked to the waist from his leaking roof and stood dripping in Mercer's warm front room with his hat in his hands and didn't say one word, and I watched him understand, and I watched him have nowhere to put it. Pete's folks. Esteban Vasquez with his bad heart, gray-lipped and gasping, and Ruth had him by the stove with a blanket before he was all the way through the door. The house took them all. That's the thing, it just kept taking them. A buried house holds its heat the way a stone holds the sun, and 20 extra bodies in it only made it warmer, and Ruth Doyle's pot of soup became loaves of bread, became whatever there was, and the children gave up the rag rug and the cards and carried mugs to shivering grown-ups. And by the time the gray afternoon was failing into a second black night, there were 30-some souls down in that hill. Every house on the road emptied into the one we'd laughed at. And the storm screamed over the top of us and could not get in. And the whole time, out in that storm, a man was pulling a sled toward a sick child alone. I made my runs. I counted them off against the fuel, and when the last of the able folks was in, when there was no one left to fetch but the Hennings, I poured what gas remained into the snowmobile's tank and Mercer's measured out can into a smaller can lashed behind the seat, and I went out one more time into the dark to find him, just like he'd told me to. Don't argue the parts. Just do them. I found him a mile and a half short of the Hennings. He was down. He wasn't dead. I want you to know that fast, the way I wished somebody could have known it fast that night, because the half-second I saw the dark shape of him sprawled across the harness in the snow, I felt my heart simply stop, the way you stop when the worst thing has finally happened. He'd gone down in the lee of a fence line where he'd stopped to rest, and the cold had reached into him while he was still, the way it does, and he couldn't get back up under the weight of the harness, and he'd been lying there fighting it. I could see the churned snow where he'd struggled, and losing. The wool hat had saved his face. His hands, even in the good gloves, were going. He looked up at me out of a rime of frost, and he tried to say something, and it came out as nothing, just breath. And then he got it on the second try. "Baby," he said, "get the baby." Not "help me," not "I'm freezing." Get the baby. I have turned that over 10,000 times. A man a mile and a half from dying in the snow, and the entire contents of his mind was a child he'd never met at the far end of a road. I got him onto the snowmobile. I don't fully know how. The cold makes you strong and stupid both. And I ran him the mile and a half to the Hennings instead of home, because home was 3 miles the wrong way and the Hennings had a stove and a roof, leaking or not, and because Mercer wouldn't have let me turn around. I hammered on the Hennings' door, and Dale Henning opened it onto a cold, dark house, and his wife Esther behind him, gray as ash with the baby in her arms. The baby breathing in little snatched pulls you could hear across the room, this small terrible sound. And I about fell into their entryway with a half-frozen man hanging off my shoulder shouting at them that there was a warm house 4 miles off that the storm couldn't touch. And we had a sled built to carry her, built for exactly this. If we could only get a body strong enough into the harness. We got Mercer to the stove. We got life back into his hands, screaming life, the kind that means the hands are saved and wishes they weren't. And it was Dale Henning, a big quiet farmer who I'd heard call Mercer the Mole Man more than once over coffee, who looked at that beautiful broad-runnered sled that I'd hauled the last stretch behind the snowmobile, and looked at his daughter fighting for breath, and put the harness over his own shoulders without a word. Mercer couldn't pull any more, but Mercer's sled could carry, and the answer he'd spent 4 years building in the dark of a hill turned out not to need his own back in the end. It just needed to exist, to be ready, to be the thing that was there when there was nothing else. Dale pulled. I ran the snowmobile ahead, breaking what trail I could on the last of the fuel. Esther rode behind me with her husband's strength out front in the harness, and her baby in the sheepskin basket, with the wool bonnet folded down over the wind. We made the warm house a little after midnight. The baby lived. I'll give you that plainly because the night gave it to us plainly, with no ceremony. They got her down into the warm, still air of that buried house, out of the killing cold that had been squeezing her small lungs for 2 days, and within an hour the snatched breathing eased, and by morning she was crying, a good, furious, healthy cry, the best sound I ever heard, and Ruth Doyle held her so Esther could finally sleep, and 30-some people who'd spent 4 years on a joke sat in the warm yellow light and listened to a baby cry like it was the bells of heaven. Mercer lost the tips of 2 fingers on his left hand. The frost had gone too deep, out there in the lee of the fence where the cold had caught him resting. He never made much of it. He'd hold up the hand sometimes after, in the years that came, and say it was a fair trade and not talk about it further, and he'd go back to whatever he was building, because he was always building. The storm blew 3 more days. The county plow didn't reach our road for 9. By the time it did, every soul on that stretch had lived a week packed into the house we'd called a hole, sleeping on its floors, eating from its stores, kept alive by 50-degree earth and a south window full of weak winter sun and the work of one odd man's hands, and not one of us died. Not one. In a storm that killed people across 3 states, our whole strung-out vulnerable road came through, because the man we'd laughed at had been laughed at into a kind of armor, had used the years we gave him of being left alone to get ready for us, and had thrown his door open the moment we needed it without once making us feel the size of what we owed. That's the story they tell now, more or less, though they've sanded the hard parts off it. They don't tell about the arithmetic, the cruel sum of the many and the one. They don't tell that Dale Henning had called him the Mole Man, or that I'd thought, for one cold, clear second in my kitchen, the monstrous practical thought I've finally set down here. They tell it like we all knew. We didn't know. That's the whole point, and they keep missing it. Mercer Doyle passed 4 years ago. Heart in his sleep, an old man in his warm house. I went to the funeral, and the little church in town couldn't hold the people, and I stood at the back, and I listened to a string of folks get up and talk about the night of the storm, and every one of them told it like they'd believed in him all along. I didn't get up. I should have. I had the truest thing to say, and I didn't have the nerve to say it in front of all those people who decided to remember themselves kindly. So I'm saying it here. I keep my logbook still. Same kind, 3 for $1 at the feed store, the weather every morning before coffee, 45 years of them now in the shoebox. And on the 8th of February I take them down and I find the page I tore out and taped back. Some folks never learn, in the ugly handwriting of the man I used to be. And underneath it, every year, I write the same line. I wrote it again this morning before I sat down to tell you all this. It says, some folks never learn, but some do. Late, watching the only lit window on the prairie and finally understanding who'd been keeping it lit. Sam Doyle runs the place now. 40-some years old, serious and watchful like he always was, like his mother. He's added on, dug deeper into the hill, his own children sleeping under the grass roof his father laid. I drive past in the evening sometimes, and I see one of them stretched out up top the way Sam used to. A kid lying on a hillside that happens to have a chimney coming out of it. And from the road, it still looks like the strangest thing in 3 counties. It doesn't look strange to me anymore. It looks like the only house out here that was ever telling the truth. And every February, when the sky goes the color of a bruise and the barometer drops and the cattle bunch against the south fence, I find myself watching that low rise on the horizon for the one yellow window, and I think about the harness, and the 2 lost fingers, and a man face down in the snow with nothing in his whole frozen mind but a child he'd never met. And I go inside and I bring in extra wood and I take down the warm hat, not the felt one,